Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. I really appreciate you taking this time. Could you please introduce yourself and your channel to whatever extent and whatever level of detail you feel comfortable with?
Sure. I'm Justin Sledge, and I run a channel called Esoterica. That is an academic historical channel. It sort of intersects with philosophy and religion as well, but I cover the history of Western esotericism from an academic lens. So that's things like alchemy, witchcraft, magic, Kabbalah, the occult, broadly construed. So that's what I focus on my channel, Esoterica.
Would I be right in saying that you've moved into this particularly small niche of history YouTube as a result of your academic studies, or is it just a
That's right.
personal interest?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
academic studies. So I have a background in philosophy, but I also have a background in religious studies. And
Mm.
there's only one degree granting institution basically in the world that allows you to study Western esotericism. That's
Oh,
changing a little
wow.
bit,
Really?
but that's the University of Amsterdam has a program, master's level and PhD level, just focusing on Western esotericism. But there's a new program in Exeter, and there are a couple other programs that are emerging. But at least when I
Mm,
was coming through, it was the only degree granting
mm,
institution in the world focusing specifically on Western esotericism. So it is an outgrowth of that academic interest, but it's also an outgrowth of the fact that I could not get a job in academia, which is the
mm.
story for a lot of people. And because I
Yeah.
couldn't secure a tenure track job, my brother Jonathan was like, "Well, you should do a YouTube channel. If you have a passion for teaching, you should follow your passion and you can do it there."
Mm.
And turns out he was right. And there's been a it's been a successful channel. We're now pushing somewhere about 750,000 subscribers. So
Yeah,
it's a
that's
relatively
very impressive. Yeah.
it's a successful channel. And it just I think it goes to show that there's a deep interest on the part of the wider
Mm,
population for reliable information on these topics because as you know, this field is rife with conspiracy theories and bigotry. And if you scratch hard enough on these videos, it's Atlantis made all the white people or
mm, mm.
some insane stuff like that. So a lot of what I'm doing is just providing reliable information on historical topics that people really want to have access to. And I think people are pretty exhausted with credulous stuff about grimoires or conspiracy theories about Gnosticism, and I think people are relatively exhausted with that kind of nonsense. And Esoterica is a academic, data-driven, evidence-based approach, and I think people appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm really delighted to see the massive success of your channel for that very reason. As I mentioned to you when I contacted you, I was delighted to see a channel like yours providing such a scholarly level of commentary on these subjects, which are typically hijacked by pop culture and very much dramatized or sensationalized by the media whenever they do comment on them. And having lived through the late 80s and early 90s new age interest in Gnosticism and Esoterica, which was incredibly banal, as I'm sure you're aware, but laid the ground for a lot of the use of Gnosticism and Hermeticism and esotericism in the pop culture wars that we're currently experiencing. Because now people have this idea of these subjects, which is largely a result of the media that they consumed much earlier on. It's refreshing to see somebody actually presenting serious, well-grounded, and yet accessible commentary on these subjects, especially at the depth to which you do. And I like the fact that you mentioned that this was very much a passion of yours. Most of the channels that I've interviewed have explained that they moved into their particular niche as a result of a personal passion. Sometimes it was related to their original studies, sometimes it was something that came out of their undergraduate studies and they later decided to do postgraduate. Sometimes it was just a side interest, which wasn't even directly related to their job, but was a personal hobby or a personal interest, which developed into a passion and then developed into a YouTube channel. And I think it's always fantastic when somebody can make a YouTube channel based on their personal passion, because I think that's when you get the really quality material. People are making this primarily to inform people and because they're excited and they're genuinely interested and they want the facts. And as a result, because you want to satisfy yourself, you have a certain standard of quality for your own work just to satisfy yourself. And I think that's fantastic because then the motivation for the quality in particular is intrinsic rather than extrinsic. You're not thinking, oh, you know, what can I get away with? It's only a YouTube video. The bar can be low, that kind of thing. You have to satisfy your own standards first. And you went into that level of detail because that's what it took to satisfy you. And then you managed to turn that into an accessible form to communicate it to others. And I found that's very much a common thread with these high quality YouTube channels that I've been interviewing.
I think that's right. And also having had academic training means that I kind of know how to present material that will be rigorous, that I know how to, cite my sources. I know how to do research. I know how to go to archives. I know where to look for manuscripts. And so it's not just a passion project in the sense that I follow my whimsy. It's also that whimsy has to be backed by a pretty evidence-based, data-driven approach. And this is a thing that, often on the screen, I can't just like go to Wikipedia. I got to go to find the scan of the manuscript at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and
Mm.
I put on the screen to show people like, look, this is where the actual archival work needs to be done, and this is not just order a book on Amazon and now you're an expert. This is a lot deeper than that. I mean, so much so that when I really get a wild hair or whatever, I've done episodes where I've had to translate text myself because there just aren't
Mm.
modern editions. They're just they aren't actually translations. And so
Mm.
there's been alchemical texts and other kinds of texts. I just finished a 14-part seminar on the occult philosopher Cornelius Agrippa, and
Mm. Yep.
almost all of the material from his Italian period there are no modern editions except for one edition in Italian. And there are no translations to English. And in order to do that seminar, I had to translate
Wow.
all that material myself from
Phenomenal.
Renaissance Latin. And it's resulting in an actual published translation. A colleague and I are actually doing a published translation. So, yeah, it's a passion project, but it's not whimsical in the sense that I get to do whatever I want. Sometimes it requires, like, if I want to do an episode on this alchemical text, there's no other option than just translating it. And so that's the kind of work that I really love doing. People love things about demons or magic, and that's the kind of stuff
Mm.
that does well by the algorithm and people like that. But as the academic and as a researcher, what I'm really interested in is like pushing the boundaries of what's being done. And that's only really possible if you're willing to, you know, troll through the Bibliothèque Nationale's scanned manuscripts and find, this one alchemical manuscript that you're interested in and actually translate it. And that's a lot of fun for me.
I really like the point that you made that your academic background gave you useful training in methodology and technique and skills, which allow you to do this in a way that other people would find it much more difficult to do or wouldn't be able to do at all. I think that's the great value of academic training. And I think that a lot of times people think that it's just an appeal to authority when somebody says, well, I've got academic training. It's not an appeal to authority unless they're saying, I've got academic training, therefore I'm correct. When they mention their academic training, usually, as you would know, they mean, I have learned a method which has been refined over decades in this field precisely to help people get accurate answers and to navigate the known unknowns and the known knowns and the typical problems in extracting information from the primary sources so that as a result, I am better able to interpret the evidence more accurately. And that academic training in any particular field is what gives the scholar their real value because they can approach a text and understand it within its socio-historical context and within its linguistic context, particularly in your case. And therefore, they can interpret that text in a more reliable way. It doesn't mean that they are always going to be right, but it does mean that they are far more likely to be reliable than a non-specialist because they have academic training. In part, especially in even in the soft study, the soft sciences, even in the humanities, we wouldn't say it's exactly the scientific method, but it does follow the same kind of process with checks and balances and peer review. There are rules, right? That you're not just wandering in there and making things up or reading a text and then deciding totally subjectively what you think it means. There are guidelines and principles, there are constraints on your interpretation which help you keep within these guidelines and help you to reach a more reliable answer, even if it's not a completely accurate answer. At least it's much more likely to be reliable. I think that's one point that people don't really appreciate. That's what I've really been trying to emphasize when I have been interviewing YouTubers who do have academic training, explaining that their particular training in their field gives them a toolbox and a set of experience and knowledge with those tools, which results in them being able to to do their research and present the material in a more accessible and more accurate way, much more likely to be accurate and useful than somebody who doesn't have that training and that knowledge. When you're talking about, for example, finding texts in the bibliothèque, I mean, obviously, a lot of people wouldn't even know where to find these texts. When years ago, when I was doing my own research into late medieval and early Renaissance esoterica and the hermetic tradition, and in particular the rise of interpretation of prophetic texts in the Bible, which was what exploded with the printing press, in particular Christian interpretations of Revelation during the early Renaissance, and the battleground of prophetic interpretation during the Reformation. I was back in Australia in the early internet era, talking about the early 90s here, looking up texts that I wanted in the database of the National Library and ordering their microfilm reels to be shipped to me from Sydney to Melbourne, where I was. Then I would take that microfilm reel to my local library and park myself in front of the microfilm reader printer and laboriously print out page by page a 200 or 300 page text, which was a microfilm copy of an original text from, for example, the early English books collection or the Thomason text with which I know the collections I know you'd be very familiar with. And then I'd get it spiral bound at a local stationery service and take it home and then thumb through it and put sticky notes all over it and that kind of thing. It's incredible to think that not long after that, actually, the early English books collection went online, and the Thompson texts as well went online, and some of those other big collections went online. And then suddenly, wow, it was phenomenal. You could download PDFs if you had a subscription, and my university did have a subscription when I was doing my master's degree, so that was just another world. So yeah, just having the knowledge of where to find those texts, either in the pre-internet, early internet era, or even now in the internet era. And of course, in your case, it'd be text which just aren't even online, especially not in any accessible form. And in your case, there was an added barrier of language where you're accessing texts which haven't even yet been translated into anything accessible for most people. The idea of you actually reading a text and having to translate it from the Renaissance Latin sounds utterly brutal. In particular, because you must have been having to first to familiarize yourself well with the typeface apart from anything else. I mean, I'm assuming it was an early printed text rather than an incunabula.
So I've worked in both.
Oh,
I'm very
wow,
lucky
really?
in that. Yeah, I'm very lucky. I'm a calligrapher as a hobby.
Oh,
And so,
fantastic. Right.
and I've copied out whole texts in lots of different hands, copied out an
Phenomenal.
entire copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics by hand on papyrus, just to give me a sense of what it was like to copy a book in the
Mm,
third century or whatever. So yeah, so luckily I have a background in calligraphy that gives me a leg up when I'm working directly with manuscripts. And my Latin, I'm not a Latinist, and so my Latin is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pretty good with Latin, and
mm.
so it's not so bad for me to be able to read these manuscripts. Some of them are quite brutal if they're heavily abbreviated or something like that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
That can be really difficult. But no, with Agrippa, it was so Agrippa exists. The Three Books of Occult Philosophy was printed in 1533, but there's also a manuscript of an earlier draft that he did that he was produced in 1510. And so I
Right.
was able to work with both of those. I have a scan and a printout of the
Hmm.
1510 manuscript. But and also deal in rare books. So I have, I literally am,
Oh, wonderful.
sitting
Yeah.
here, next, this is a copy of Hebrew Kabbalistic manuscript from 1510, and so it's also a world in which I'm able to work with rare books directly and antiquarian books directly, and you just get used to reading them. I mean, you get used to the type, you get used to the hand, you get used to scripts, and again, it's a range. Some things are very, very difficult. There's a famous necromancer's manual, CLM 849, written in a very cramped, very abbreviated sort of bookhand. It was clearly meant just to be read by the ritual practitioner. And so that's a quite difficult text to work with. But other texts, they're quite legible and, pretty easygoing. So it all depends on what it is. It all depends on what it is. It depends on
Mm.
how abbreviated it is, things like that. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. Like I said, the part of the fun thing for me is I suppose revealing to people that one, not everything is on a Google search. Two,
Yes, absolutely.
you can't go, you're not going to go to Amazon and pick these books up. And even if you do find them, and I will say that, Google Books and archive.org have been great helps just to finding these old books. But it's definitely the case where there's a really important text from the Renaissance called De Harmonia Mundi. It's huge, 1,000+ pages, and even when you find a copy, there's no modern edition, there's no translation, but it's a hugely important book of Christian Kabbalah. Um, I was looking for it because I was thinking to look through it and just to get some sense of what it is, and I found some copies, and I started noticing strange things about the copies that I was finding on Google Books and archive.org. And what I was finding is that they were all censored. The Inquisition had managed to get their hands on them at some point in
Wow,
the
that's
past and
phenomenal.
take out pages. And to my knowledge, there is exactly one copy online held by the Bibliothèque Nationale in France that is uncensored. So even if you
Mm.
find
Mm.
text online digitized, in my case, because I deal with occult topics, those topics have often brushed up against the Inquisition, and the Inquisition has edited them, censored them. And so even if you
Mm.
find a text, you can't be guaranteed that you found an uncensored version of it. So
Right.
there are unique barriers to the work that I do. And also occult texts are pretty famous because they have these very elaborate woodcuts or these very elaborate pictures, and those often get cut out. And so you'll be looking for
Right.
them in a manuscript or a text, and you're like, why is the woodcut not here? And you're like, oh, it's been removed 300 years ago, and someone's tacked it up on
Right.
their office or whatever. So
Yes.
there are unique challenges for this field, particularly. And then, of course, there's just the fact that a lot of these manuscripts, like I said, were seized by the Inquisition, so they end up in strange places, or just the fact that we have this weird belief that libraries know what they have. And the most egregious example of this is the Vatican Library. People think of the Vatican Library as kind of I don't know how to they the sort of Indiana Jones is the Ark of the Covenant and everything else is
Yes.
down in there.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is that even the holdings of the Vatican are so vast that they're not totally cataloged. So they're not even completely aware of what they have. The
Mm.
most famous proof of this is that a manuscript copy of Spinoza's Ethics, which was thought lost, the manuscripts were
Wow.
all thought
Yes.
destroyed. The copy of a manuscript of Spinoza's Ethics from one of his students who converted to Catholicism was found in the Vatican Library about 10 years ago. And of course, the
Right.
spine just read De Deo, on God.
Right.
And you can imagine how many books are called De Deo in the Vatican Library.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the
Absolutely. Yeah.
Vatican didn't even know they had it. They weren't even aware that it was there. So, and you talked about the known unknowns. The big known
Yep.
unknown is the fact
Yep.
that even among these vast holdings, we're not totally sure what's even in there because it's the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of European manuscript transmission, and who knows exactly what is in public libraries, but also private libraries. And um, rich people in the past had vast libraries that are still in families, and those families have not
Mm.
cataloged them. And often we don't even know what's in some of these libraries until these people die and their their libraries come to auction, and all of a
Well,
sudden a
that's how
brand new manuscript.
Newton's letters were. That I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, the Keynes letters, the Maynard Keynes collection from of Newton's letters was discovered. He'd been basically one guy had been sitting on them
Yeah.
until nearly halfway through the 20th century. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and then with Newton as a great example is that there's been a long since vested interest in presenting Newton as the father of science and the inventor of
Yes.
calculus and the stuff about alchemy and his stuff about numerology and the
Mm.
rebuilding of the temple, which Newton was far more interested. He wrote far more on alchemy than he
Yes.
did on
Yes.
calculus. That meant that material was very carefully guarded because
Mm.
the Royal Society had a vested interest in a certain vision of who Newton was. And it's only in the middle of the 20th century and really the latter part of the 20th century where we're now getting a fuller vision of who Isaac Newton was as an intellectual and as a mystic, because people very carefully guarded what you could get access to. And so robust studies of his alchemical stuff really only began in the middle of the 20th century. And so
Mm.
this is a kind of gatekeeping and censorship that still goes on because we want to protect a certain vision of history, and that vision of history is a very much sort of enlightenment driven, rational, democratic
Right.
idea of who these great characters were. And the truth of the matter, of course, is that history it doesn't conform to preconceived notions of how it was supposed to have gone. I'm not a believer in the occult. I'm not a practitioner. This is not
Yep.
part of my spiritual vocation. Um, But what I am a believer in is doing history properly and doing the history of philosophy properly.
Yes.
And I was basically told in graduate school, just don't study this stuff. If you study this stuff, you're going to get sidelined, and because no one takes this stuff seriously. And I was repeatedly told, you can't if you write a paper about Descartes and you present Descartes as a mystic, you're going to go against the vision of rationalism that we're all teaching, and people are not going to take that seriously. And I'm like, I don't really care what people take seriously. The truth of the matter is, rationalism was born out of a bunch of dreams he had, where he was visited
Mm.
by a
Right.
supernatural divine being. We don't get to change that. That's just the way the history is. And so, if we're going to do the business of history and the development of the overall spiritual or philosophical development in Western history, we don't get to curate that. We have to put it out there. And that's a big part of what I've been doing is that we love to tell ourselves a story about the history of religious and philosophical development that's really divorced from how it actually developed in a sort of Rankian sense of, how things really happened.
Right.
And
I
the
think
the
that's
occult had a huge role in all that, a massive role in all that.
I think that speaks very much to the importance, the current day importance of these issues, because they are used as foundational myths for the modernist project or the Enlightenment project, or however we want to describe it. And I really take your point about the way that these historical figures are reinterpreted for that purpose. A personal friend of mine, Stephen Snowbelin, is actually one of the foremost scholars on Newton and has been one of the leaders of the Newton Project, the online
Hmm.
Newton Project, and has written a lot illustrating the other side of Newton, his attempts to create an architectural plan of the temple that would be built during the Kingdom Age when Jesus
Right,
returns to the earth in
right. And he,
meticulous
and he published a book on it.
mathematical detail. Yeah,
He
that's
published
right.
a huge
Yeah.
book on this that no one ever talks about.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. Yeah. And also his more heretical Unitarian beliefs and
yeah, he
his
was an Aryan too.
anti-Trinitarianism. Yeah.
Yeah.
And his connection with a small group of Unitarians and Arians or semi-Arians, Arians like Joseph Whiston, and how he had to keep that under the covers. So he was in I think Whiston's words, a Nicodemite, somebody who believed what Whiston believed, but wanted to keep wanted to keep this under wraps. And it was known, but an exception was made when he was given a political appointment. An exception was made that he didn't have to be a member of the Anglican Church, which was anathema to his personal faith. An exception was made just because he was Newton.
Mhm.
But yeah, it just demonstrates. I mean, you'd be aware that the fact I honestly cannot remember who said it, but the famous phrase about Newton, which kind of emerged as a result of this new side of
Right.
Newton being developed, was that he was the last of the magicians and the first of the scientists. Whereas people tend to regard him as one of the first of the scientists. I can't remember who said it, but they said that he was not only the first of the scientists, he was the last of the magicians. He's literally on this dividing line with one foot in both worlds, as it were, which I think is a very neat way of putting it. I mean, you could quibble about the extent to which he was one of the last of the magicians, but I think it's legitimate to, as a phrase, to identify that duality in the world he operated in. Even though his, as we've talked about before, his approach to alchemy was far more naturalistic and chemical than it was spiritual, he still had this enormous interest in religious matters, and his faith was absolutely I mean, he was absolutely a believer. His personal letters are full of his personal expressions and prayers to God, not to mention his thousands of pages of biblical interpretation. The other point I appreciate you mentioning was the issue of the difficulty of texts which just don't exist in translation or have been censored in some way. I remember one text that I was delighted to finally get my hands on. It was an interpretation of the book of Daniel, an exposition of the book of Daniel by George Joy, a 16th century Christian expositor. He was also a Bible translator, in fact, and he got into trouble for all the usual kinds of reasons, theological reasons. And I was delighted to have in my hands a microfilm reel which had been produced in Michigan in 1976. The archival cord hadn't even been unrolled since it was first tied. So I was the first person to open it since 1976, which gave me a thrill. And then I was printing out in microfilm George Joy's exposition of Daniel, which I think he wrote in 1550, and it was burned the subsequent year. So I'm thinking, wow, I've got this connection with this very tenuous piece of history. I was just reminded of that when you talked about how we deal with texts which maybe barely exist or only exist in heavily censored form because of the various vicissitudes of history and the way things go. I have to say I was very impressed by your mention of Latin because I only did classical Latin, like classical and early Roman Latin. I did it for a year and a half. I just hated it. I was not very good at all. It was an absolute beast. And we had to try and read Tacitus and Cicero
No, so, I
and
mean, yeah,
people who and live in those historians who hardly use any words, and you kind of feel like I just learned all this grammar, and these guys aren't even using half of it. They're just missing out words left, right, and center for the sake of efficiency, and I'm just struggling to understand what on earth they're talking about. Um,
no, it's
Mind
a
you, I
very
did two
different
years
thing
of Greek, and
to
I
read.
wasn't much better than that.
And Greek's much more challenging. Yeah, I mean, again, it all depends on Latin. You put Cicero in front of me, that's a lot harder than a Renaissance a
Right,
writer. Although Renaissance Latin now has its own problems because they're aping that classical style, and they don't ape it very
I
well.
see.
And so
Right,
they're doing some of those things. But yeah, I mean, the really difficult Latin is medieval Latin. That's such the grammar is so degenerated that they just throw in demonstratives and prepositions to
right,
try to make sense of things, and it just doesn't. You're just throwing in all these words that do more to corrupt the sense of what you're trying to express, or they're barely literate in Latin. Like many magical texts are not written by people who are
right,
great Latinists, and often the Latin is so poor that the vernacular is seeping in, and so they'll just take a Spanish word or German word and Latinize it, and it's just like a mess. These Again, we tend to think of medieval magicians or medieval sorcerers as being highly learned people, and they were learned relative to maybe the population in general, but they're not Thomas Aquinas. You're not going to get the great
yes,
Latinity of Duns Scotus.
mm,
It's a working man's Latin, lower level churchman, and so it's often not the best Latin in the world, and that produces its own unique challenges when it comes uh, to doing the translation work. So yeah, there is something funny about seeing this sort of grand invocation to angels or demons or whatever, and the grammar is all a mess. One wonders if the angels or demons could even understand what they were talking about.
yeah, right, yeah. I mean, I've tried reading Bede in Latin, which was very difficult, and he was for his era, he was a literate, learned man.
Hmm.
And I've tried reading Joachim of Fiore in Latin, which is, well, oh, actually, even much more difficult, even much more
Yeah, even
difficult.
even if you understand what he's
Um,
saying in the Latin, it's what he's saying in
oh,
general. And
oh,
walking
oh
with
yeah,
Fiore is a
that's right.
bizarre,
It's
an absolutely
so
bizarre theoretician.
loaded, yeah, so loaded with his own mysticism underneath, and he's saying something that I have no idea if I'm supposed to, if this is a metaphor, or if it's a complex analogy, or if it's supposed to be a parable. Especially when he's talking about his future age,
Hmm.
um, which in some ways looks like just a super monastery, just a jumped up version of what he's used to, only much more strict. And it sometimes looks far more spiritual. We're trying to, I mean, reading it in English translation, I'm always going to the footnotes to try and figure out, okay, there's got to be a caveat. This doesn't seem to agree with what he said before. And yet, sure enough, there's a caveat here. He may have meant this, he may have meant that. And looking at the Latin, frankly, doesn't help me at all because I just struggle to get through a sentence of his unless I've got a critical text next to it.
Right. And
Um,
walking with Fiore is especially challenging. And that's another layer of all this esoteric stuff is that, they're there's a the esoteric writing means that they're obfuscating their meaning to some degree. And so not only are you having to read, but you're having to read between the lines and you're having to
yes, right.
like, are they telling me the whole truth? Are they saying one thing and meaning another? This is not like reading Tacitus where he's just telling you the history at some level, or Caesar or
Yes,
something.
yes.
It's people deliberately trying to hide in plain sight. And so that's another dimension of, again, the challenges that go into studying this material is that you're not just getting a straight narrative like you might get in someone like Bede, but you're getting
Mm,
someone who's trying to communicate and then at the same time trying to hide something from the reader
right.
or from the Inquisition or whatever. And that adds another layer to the difficulty. And part of my job and part of what I have to say on the channel a lot, and I think people find some people find refreshing and some people find annoying, is that there are just limits to what we know. And
Yes,
we
yes.
come to boundaries and we're just like, we don't know what this text means. This is either gobbledygook or it's some kind of code or it's some kind of magical incantation. It's not the place where I get, I can speculate and, I can speculate about meanings and that's fine. But often we just come to a wall and we say, look, the text is corrupt here and we don't know what this means. And
Right.
people, they desperately like, well, what you have to tell me what it means.
Mm, mm.
And, you can always trust a scholar by how quickly they're willing to say we don't know.
I
Yeah.
really appreciate those history YouTube channels who say, look, I've got a number of sources here and they don't agree. And
Hmm.
there's no easy way to settle this. And I can give you the scholarly consensus and I can offer some caveats on that from my own perspective. And that's all I got. There's a young guy who runs a channel on the Civil War, for example. Wow, I wouldn't even touch the American Civil War. The sources are literally all over the place. Everybody disagrees with everyone else for very obviously self-motivated reasons. And one guy might report the same event differently in his, say, a general might write a formal military report, which says one thing. He's got a letter to his wife that says something else. And then later on in a political speech, he might interpret it, say it represented a different way. And it's just this one guy talking about the same thing. Never mind what the other side's saying.
The unique challenge is that history does not speak univocally. It is a
Mm,
polyvocal
yeah, polyvocal.
business.
Yeah.
And that polyvocality of history is just a thing we have to become comfortable with. That we're in the rare cases that we can know what happened, we should cherish those because most of the time it's just a big mess. And again, this is what you can always tell conspiracy theories and stuff like this because they don't. Conspiracy theories are the least messy things. It's a nice, tidy, clean version of how things happened, and that's a really good indicator that it's
Yes.
wrong.
Actually, on one point, I want to return to just briefly to one point on Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, whose text you've studied obviously in a far greater depth than myself, and I've only read him in translation. And as you can imagine, the text that of his with which I'm most familiar, which is basically the only text I've really read in detail, is his commentary on the preeminence of women. Because of
Mhm.
course, there's a lot of discussion about the extent to which Agrippa was an early proto-feminist, which is entirely possible, and the extent to which he's influenced by earlier writers like Christina de Pizan obviously is debated. But I was wondering if you had a commentary on whether his views on women derived from earlier writers such as Christina, or whether they were in fact derived in some way from his esoteric beliefs and esoteric tradition, because that part of his writing is something I'm much less familiar with.
I think that definitely I mean, Agrippa's a Renaissance man, so he's always going to be
Yep,
leaning on previous historical texts. That's part of
right,
what is so difficult. He's
sure,
constantly quoting people without telling you he's quoting people. But yeah, that's definitely true. And the preeminence of women. I mean, also he's writing this basically to get a job. I mean, he's trying to butter up Margaret of Austria, who I
right,
can't imagine
okay.
would have had any time in the world for this book. And he bungled the whole business anyway, by basically lecturing on some heterodox stuff that got the priests upset, and that basically, insofar as academia was underwritten by the church at some level, once you make that mistake, that's kind of you're on the outs. And he was accused of Judaizing, and that was basically the end of it. That text is interesting for lots of reasons. One of which, he does introduce sort of Kabbalistic arguments for why women are preeminent to men, and there's these hermetic and Kabbalistic arguments that are interesting. So that's one element where you do have this sort of esoteric element coming into that text. The other element that I think is interesting about to what degree Agrippa is a proto-feminist or whatever with that debate is that it's conspicuous what we don't see in Agrippa. And what we don't see in Agrippa is a constant sort of low-level misogyny that's typical of that time period. Agrippa almost always speaks very highly of women. He speaks very highly of of his wives and his letters. And also, Agrippa did a rather extraordinary thing. I think when he was at Metz, he defended a so-called witch. And from a jurisprudential point of view, that's a very dangerous thing to do because if the witch is convicted, her attorney is also culpable. Um, and so this is a very dangerous gambit. And he defended her on both theological and also procedural lines. He just felt this woman was being railroaded, and also the theological arguments being used by the local inquisitor were bunk. And so this is a place where Agrippa enters into the witchcraft debates in a way that's also very
Right.
progressive.
Yep.
Literally defending a witch at his own peril, an alleged witch. Of course, there are no witches in the Middle Ages, as far as we can tell, early modern period. And I think that's fascinating. I think that's a place where, again, Agrippa didn't have to do that. He could have done what I think everyone else did and watched these women be murdered by the thousands. And for whatever reason, Agrippa, inserted himself in that debate in a way that I think made a huge impression on his student, Johann Weyer. And of course, Johann Weyer
Yes,
would later
definitely. Yeah.
wrote De
Yeah.
Prestigi Daemonum,
Very,
where he
very
argued that
significant work. Mm.
very significant. I mean, Freud called it the most important book ever written. I'm not sure that's true. But Johann Weyer was a student of Agrippa, and Weyer argued that these women were being killed basically because they were suffering from what we would now call mental illness, melancholia.
Mm.
Um, and so Weyer, as a student of Agrippa, was a skeptic about the witch panic. And again, this
Mm.
is a thing, and that earned him the ire of James the First and Sixth. And that's the thing that you don't want to have a monarch attacking
Right.
you in print the way that Johann Weyer was. But again, this is a moment where you're never going to be the popular person if and people are in a panic and you stand up in the middle of the room and say, "All right, everyone, let's calm down for a second and think critically." You're going to be you're going to be pounced upon. That's not a popular thing to do. And
Mm.
Weyer and Agrippa or were some of the earliest people to jump, basically rise their head up and say, "I think this witch panic is crazy. Something
Mm.
is very badly going on here." And I have enormous amounts of admiration for both Agrippa and for Johann Weyer for standing up in the midst of one of the greatest conspiracy theories and moral panics in European history, responsible for the death of murder of 40 to 60,000 women, we now
Mm.
think. And there's some of the few voices to come up and say, "I think that this is crazy. I don't think that this is real." And I have a lot of admiration for that.
Yeah, that's really useful. And I really appreciate you linking him to that defense of women during the early modern witch trials. That's a subject I've looked into in some depth, and I've made a couple of videos on. I have a couple more to make on that, debunking some of the pop history myths, not to mention that quite apart from the death toll, but other myths as well. And I want to cover as well the fact that up to about the 13th or 14th century, belief in witches was a heresy. And it was only much later, due to theological changes, that belief in witches became acceptable. Earlier on, you have bishops railing against their congregation,
Yeah.
saying, "Stop believing in this stuff. It's pagan nonsense. We thought we told you only God can do this. Satan can't because that would make him equal to God, and then in that case, neither can the demons. Only God is the creator. He's the only one who has power over the natural world." So,
Right. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the point I thought you made was really good was that when we come to think about the extent to which Agrippa was genuinely a proto-feminist, on the one hand, yes, this text of his, which he wrote, you can see is very self-motivated, but on the other hand, he had no personal benefit standing up for those women. I mentioned Agrippa actually in a couple of my videos on the early modern witch hunt, and of course connecting with there and other of the early modern jurists
Hmm.
who took their job very seriously and were looking just basically at it from an evidential perspective and saying, well, okay, from a legal perspective, we have certain standards of evidence. And I mean, regardless of the fact that they very much, a lot of them even believed in witches, they just wanted to see the evidence and they became very skeptical that witches were actually leaving any evidence.
This is a place where the Inquisition was actually relatively progressive in a strange way.
Right.
That
Yeah.
in inquisitional courts they had evidentiary standards, and also if you're convicted of a capital case, it got at least in France and places, it got kicked to a bishop as an appellate judge. And
Right.
if you got arrested for witchcraft, it's far better to be arrested in inquisitional territory, because if you're arrested in Protestant territory, you're convicted and killed that day. But at
Right.
least in France, you were convicted and it was kicked over to an appellate court, and those appellate courts typically were much more careful. And the Inquisition was in many ways a break on the excesses of the trials. And again, this is also a place where we think of things like swimming the witch. Swimming witches was forbidden as an ordeal by the Fourth Lateran Council, and so in Catholic areas, these kind of trial ordeals were ecclesiastically forbidden, but they went on in places where the Protestants were in control. And so it's again to understand the early modern witch trials is really it's a mess, because you're having to the locality of the trials really determines all kinds of things.
Yeah, the geography, the socioeconomic factors,
All right.
the theological beliefs. And then I think I really like the point you made about the Inquisition, which obviously there's a lot that can be said about the Inquisition, but they did have higher evidentiary standards. And
Right.
in a number of cases with the Inquisition, which actually quenched witch panic outbreaks, the Inquisitor Salazar during the 16th century, what I find fascinating about him is he started using the Edict of Silence to quench witch hunt beliefs. He said there were no witch hunts in this area until people started talking about them. And he made a connection, which I think, I mean, obviously he wouldn't have had the psychological framework in mind, but he understood that, you know what, if we make an edict of silence which says you are forbidden under pain of ecclesiastical punishment from talking about witches, suddenly witchcraft disappears, witches disappear, cattle stop dying, babies stop dying from having spells put on them, and people don't see witches anymore. He said, like, when people stop talking about it, the witches disappear. I mean, which was brilliant because he understood in some way, I'm sure he understood this was moral panic. He didn't have the psychological framework or the vocab, but he understood, the best way to stop these witch hunts, you just make people stop talking about it. And then suddenly all the supernatural events disappear. And I mean, it's a pretty, pretty brilliant connection to make because he realized at some level this is, well, what we would call a moral panic. He didn't have the vocab for it, but he said there were no witches in this area until people started talking about them. These people over here moved here and started talking about witches. No one was mentioning it before. And then all of a sudden, cattle are dying and someone's putting a spell on someone else. And as soon as you tell people to stop, the edict of grace and the edict of silence, firstly, anyone who wants to confess, fine. Here's an edict of grace. You can confess, no punishment at all. That kind of acts as the safety valve. So,
Hmm.
okay, so you've got, which is fine. We're going to forgive them all. So no one is allowed to have any animosity now. God's forgiven them. You've got to put away your feelings of vengeance. And next, the edict of silence. And by the way, no more talk about witches. Done deal. Yeah, very arguably saved hundreds of lives in that way too. It's just fascinating if he'd had the psychological framework, how he could have written that up in a a more formal way. But I think that he was brilliant to see that connection. And like some of the jurists as well, thinking that this doesn't pass the sniff test, it doesn't meet us standards of evidence which we apply in every other situation. And again, even when they did believe in witches, they just don't seem to believe in the kind of evidence that we'd expect if they were present here.
Right. Or seeing the other side too is also terrifying, is seeing jurists manipulate their own standards of evidence to include it,
Mm,
like the spectral evidence in the colonies and stuff like that.
right.
Um,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Salem witch trials in
So,
particular, of
yeah.
course. Yeah.
And so, but also, yeah, places were like, no, no, we're not doing spectral evidence. It's ridiculous. Like, dreams are not an
Yeah.
indicator of what happened.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it again. It's this is I've done a good bit of episodes on the early modern witch trials, and part of the reason why I do those episodes is because basically what they were was mass murder because of a conspiracy theory, and I think that we're
Right.
now in the
Right.
grips of conspiratorial thinking, especially here in the United States, where
Absolutely. Yeah.
conspiracy thinking is really an epidemic. And I know it's me covering the early modern witch trials is just making me ringing a bell saying, look, these conspiracy theories can be murderous. They can be, frankly,
Mm,
they can be very dangerous. And the early modern witch trials, the so-called elaborated theory of witchcraft, was a vast
mm,
conspiracy theory.
mm.
Um, that was believed by a huge chunk of the population, and it resulted in significant death. I mean, mass murder.
We've seen those same moral panics, the Red Scare, the satanic panic of the 80s, which I remember very distinctly. And then, of course, it comes back in various ways. Well, most recently, perhaps the slander of Haitian immigrants
Mhm.
and their supposed eating of people's pets and people. Exactly the same kind of thing with exactly the same kind of dynamic and very much the same kind of reasons as well. Moving on to more specific questions, can you describe your research methodology and the steps that you take to ensure quality in your videos? And I can understand that this is going to be very much based on the academic method and the tools that you've learned as a result of your studies.
Yeah, I center peer review. So my sources, insofar as I'm able, they're peer reviewed. If I can't get peer review, for instance, if I'm working on a translation myself, I definitely send it to colleagues of mine to vet it who are Latinists. For instance, Dr. Dana Trell is a Latinist, and I've worked with him when I need aid there. But yeah, the big academic process is if I'm starting with a text, I look at the field and say, all right, where is the scholarship on the field? And I go to those sources that are peer reviewed and reliable. I look at critical editions. I work from critical editions when they exist. That's sometimes not the case. They simply don't exist. What I aim for is to present the scholarly consensus as much as possible. And when there are debates in the field, which there often are, I try to present those debates as fairly as I can, as diplomatically as I can. And when I do wade into a debate, I don't do that unless I have some expertise on that topic. I don't shoot from the hip when I'm producing content, and what I try to do is present where the scholarship is and not what I believe. So often it's the case that when I present a topic, there's definitely been cases where I don't actually agree with the scholarly consensus. I think that it's wrong, or I think that it's mistaken, but I don't have the luxury to be like, oh, and all these scholars are wrong. No, I have to present where the scholarship is. And insofar as I do introduce my own opinions, I make it very clear that this is what I think, and this is an opinion, or this is a divergence from the consensus. And that's sort of the big methodology that I use. I mean, the idea is that any esoterica video should be able to be played in a university classroom and pass muster in that setting. And I'm very excited to know that there in fact are university professors playing esoteric episodes in their classroom. And to
That's
me, that's
fantastic.
the ultimate benchmark, is
Mm.
do my colleague, and again, I'm talking about colleagues in my field, whether
Yeah,
it's
that's real peer review. That's
it's
genuine
peer
peer
review.
review.
Yeah, they're
Mm.
like, look, this passes muster, and they'll I know that it's funny, sometimes I'll see a big spike at the very beginning of the fall term in certain videos, and I'm like, oh, some professor has assigned my video on Malleus Maleficarum or whatever, and so that's to me it's very heartwarming just to know that your peers out there, your academic peers, are using your video, and yeah, and also I'm totally open to, if I make a mistake, I'll go back and record in a sort of an errata video, being like, oh, the scholarship has changed, or There's definitely videos where I've made a video, and one example of this is Al-Kindi. He wrote, I made an episode on his book on the stellar rays, and scholarship has now moved on, and now there's a good reason to believe that Al-Kindi did not write that. It is
Mm,
now referred to as pseudo Al-Kindi, and so in the doc right now is me rewriting that episode because scholarship has got updated, and I need to go back in and include arguments to show that there's good reason to believe that Al-Kindi did not, in fact, write on stellar rays.
mm.
And so that's a place where also, um, and it's also nice because it's not my ego is not wrapped up in it. If I
Right,
present
correct. Yep.
if I make an episode and it turns out that scholarship has changed, it wasn't that I'm not wrong. The scholarship just moved on, and so
Yep.
now it's time to update it, whether it's this new episode on Al-Kindi or whatever. So those are some of the
Just
basic.
like science.
Sure, yeah, it's
Yeah.
new manuscripts get found, new interpretations
Hmm.
get made.
Yep.
The
Hypotheses
Hermeticism
and
stuff.
models must change when new
Yeah,
evidence comes.
yep, yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
Hermeticism is about to undergo a huge shift because Christian Wilberg is preparing a new critical edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, where he's going to argue that the text is full of all kinds of interpolations and all kinds of
Mm.
glosses that are actually not original to the text. And that's going to completely shift the field. And so, that tidal wave is coming, and I'm going to have to redo basically all my, at least some of my Hermeticism videos based on that new critical edition. And that's just again, that's just the way things go. You have to, especially in a field that's as young as Western esotericism. We're as a field, we've only really existed as a field since the 1990s. And so changes come fast and thick, and you have to be willing to roll those punches. And yeah, my ego's not wrapped up in that. It's just like this is a scholarship, and that's where it goes.
I really like the fact that you've mentioned a couple of times critical editions. I keep meaning to set aside some time to make a video on what a critical edition is and how the English translation that a lot of people will read of a text, especially a popular translation or trade publication translation, is often very far removed from the primary source from which it was taken, or the primary sources, plural, even in
Right.
the case of texts which people think are basically immutable, literally written in stone. And then, as you would know, in reality, they're reading an English translation, which is itself a synthesis from a critical text, which is itself a synthesis from multiple primary sources, some of them incomplete. So that critical edition will actually have lacunae and hapax legomena and interpretive glosses. And when it comes to things being written on stone, people don't realize that, well, yeah, actually we have 5 inscriptions of this particular decree, and they were written at different times. And we suspect that one of them may have been effaced by a later ruler, and part of the earliest one is missing, and they were in different regions and they're in different scribal hands. And we suspect that they weren't exact copies of each other. So, what kind of translation do we end up with here? How do we synthesize this material? I think it's particularly ironic that a lot of the texts that we know, for example, the Akkadian and Sumerian texts that we have because they are literal schoolboy exercises. They're literally what we would call pages from some schoolboy's handwriting practice book. These young scribes learning how to write by copying out the epics. And that's one of the reasons why we have so many copies of them. And then you can see how that the quality of any given text obviously is very determined on the knowledge and the skill of the scribe. So I'd really love to do a video one day on kind of demystifying that translation process and helping people understand what's actually underneath it and helping people to understand the appreciation of a critical text, especially when I read, for example, whenever I'm reading the New Testament, at least I can read in a critical text Josephus in a critical text. At least my Greek is okay for that. For the Latin, I usually need a lexicon, a critical text, and a lexicon, and maybe an English crib as well. But I think that's, again, another dimension of scholarship that people do not appreciate and demonstrates, again, the fact that when scholars have done the work here, that to present this information, they have to go through a very complex method. They need a method of dealing with all these uncertainties. And one of the reasons why they are more likely to be reliable and accurate than a non-scholar is because they are playing by the rules. They have an established method. You can actually check what they've done. They can show they're working out.
Hmm.
Whereas somebody who doesn't have that training and doesn't have a method is far more likely to introduce subjective interpretations. So I want to do a video on that one day. And one day as well, I have to make a video on what scholarly consensus really means. It's not just a question of most scholars believe this, therefore it's true. It's a question of not really a question of numbers, as you would appreciate. It's about the process. The importance of scholarly consensus is not simply the number of scholars who agree. It's how that scholarly process was reached through a relentless process of distillation through numerous rounds of peer review, cross-examination, multiple independent scholars arriving at the same conclusions from different perspectives, cross-examining each other, and gradually, organically coming, not in a conspiratorial way. This is the great thing about peer review. It's the opposite. If anything, it's a competitive, so that scholars aren't naturally inclined just to agree with everybody else. There's a certain amount of pushback and cross-examination as people's personal pet theories might clash. And the value of that scholarly consensus is it's been arrived at despite people's personal views in a lot of ways. And as you said yourself, you're entirely prepared to modify your interpretations, revise your hypotheses, edit or comment on your videos and correcting them, saying, well, I mean, my views changed because the evidence changed. I established this view based on the evidence available, and that was the scholarly consensus at the time. The scholarly consensus has now shifted, and it's shifted for very good reasons. There's more evidence we need to take account of. The existing model doesn't fit anymore. So I'm very fascinated by your comments on this critical edition of Hermeticism and the Corpus Hermetica. And what you say doesn't surprise me. To some extent, people knew there were various revisions over time and various interpolations that happens with any body of literature. But obviously, the extent to which this has happened is paradigm shifting. So I'm fascinated to see you make a video about that. You think you'll be
Yeah,
making a video about that, on, obviously, when it's published, and you'll be able to distill the scholarship and make it more accessible to the layman like myself?
that's the idea. That's the idea. I mean, I have to get my hands on it. I've
Mm-hmm.
talked to Professor Vilberg behind the scenes. I just had to get some glimpses of it, and I have some ideas of what's going to be there and what's not going to be there, and it is going to be pretty titanic. Um, Talking about critical editions, the one of my favorite examples of how that really can shift things around is in the field of alchemy.
Right.
Alchemical literature is all over the place, and Professor Lawrence Principe is one of the great scholars of alchemy in our
Oh,
generation.
yes. I found
Um,
him invaluable in understanding the Muslim contribution to alchemy. Just wealth of detail with copious references to primary sources. Really, really
yeah,
great.
he's fantastic. But he did a great he did a great thing where so there's a great alchemist from 14th century, John Rupesisha, and John Rupesisha wrote a couple different alchemical treatises, and they exist in several manuscripts and several printed editions. And the question was, which is the more reliable of the actual texts?
Mm.
And on textual grounds, it's difficult to know which is the more reliable text until Professor Principe recreated um, John Rupesisha's experiments, and he realized
Oh,
that as you
wow.
recreate the experiment, there were certain visual things that happened that are only recorded in certain manuscripts, and you could see things like certain colors. And from that forensic recreation, Dr. Principe was able to argue that this manuscript tradition is the more reliable one because this one actually is reflected in the actual alchemical procedure, and therefore that this stemma of manuscripts is probably the
Mm.
more true to the original manuscript, the original autograph. And so that's a neat place where it's not just a question of how do we establish a critical edition or how do we establish even a stemma, the history of manuscript transmission, is how do we know which ones are reliable when we don't, in this case, we can only know which one was reliable by literally recreating the alchemical experiment and noticing that the corruptions that it snuck in had snuck in because people were simply copying manuscripts. Corruption snuck in, they copied the corruptions, but in this other tradition, it maintained it, and we could check the between the two because the actual forensic reproduction only appeared in one manuscript transmission, one stemma. So that's a neat place where not only is it a question of developing critical editions, but also how do you determine which readings are the correct readings? And that was a place where it was only possible to establish it by literally reproducing in a lab what John Ripposiccia had done, way back in the 14th century. So those are just
That, yeah,
that's the stuff that I love. I just love that kind of stuff. And in my field, in the field of Western esotericism, the field is so new and it's so interdisciplinary, and because it's so new, there's so much to be done, that you can really just work on basically any problem, and you're going to be cutting new ground almost immediately, because I mean, many of these texts, no one's had eyes on them in hundreds of years sometimes, and so again, I mentioned this Agrippa seminar that I did. I don't know that anyone's lectured on that stuff. Some of that stuff has never been translated to English, and I don't know that anyone's ever done lectures on it at all. And so it's just a fun place where you can really push scholarship. Um, and it was really heartwarming to see that, I looked at the 13th lecture of 14, by 13 lectures on one person, people are getting fatigued, but that still had 10,000 views. And it just
wow,
shows you that there's a real
impressive.
interest in this material, and people really are hungry for it. And it's really an honor for me to be able to, to take stuff that's highly inaccessible, and make it accessible for a wider population of folks who are keenly interested.
I loved the example you gave of the reconstruction of the more correct version of the critical edition on the basis of selecting which of the stemma in the tradition were more accurate. And that being a great example of that kind of forensic investigation, which is necessary to build a reliable critical text. And on that, I'd just like to ask if you have a view on how that divergence happened. Could it be, and I'm speculating as a layman here, that one the faulty stemma resulted from copyists who were not practically involved in the
Mhm.
art and were copying the texts maybe for tradition's sake or for an more intellectual but less practical alchemical tradition, whereas the more accurate one, which reflected literally the practical experimentation, was a result of copyists who belonged to a living practical alchemy, as it were, who were able to maintain the accuracy because it reflected what they saw in their experimentation, or is that a bit too speculative?
I think it's probably both. I think that there's good evidence that some of these texts are being copied by people who are practically oriented, and that helped to keep the text reliable. Also, I think that in this case, I think also there was a place where the Latin itself was, you could transpose a couple of letters and you got a different word,
Right, I
and
see. Yep.
you just got a textual corruption. And once that corruption had snuck in, it got repeated. The game of
Mhm.
telephone that happens with
Yes, yes.
manuscripts. So I think that those were primarily the cases there. Um, and then printing. We love printing, and we obviously should love printing, but part of the process that can be dangerous when you get to a printed text is that just because a printer's printed something doesn't actually make it a reliable text. They could have printed something from bad manuscripts, and that can be really
Right.
bad because once they printed it, that will get reprinted, and now we think of the
Mm.
text as that being the actual text. And the truth of the matter is sometimes manuscripts are actually far more reliable than early modern printed texts. So, so it's just a fun, this is a fun forensic game of trying to trace this stuff down. And, I love just sort of getting into this material, and seeing where the conversation goes from history. And, um, whether it's alchemy or Kabbalah or magical texts are also highly dynamic in the manuscript tradition, because they're magical texts are much more like cookbooks than they are any other kind of material, and cookbooks are very much about doing it. It's all about, the Latin word for a magical spell is experimenta. It's a thing that you do. And
Right.
so many of these magical textbooks will have notes like, don't do it on this day with, with Mars rising, do it on this day. This is sort of magicians, sorcerers having done the experiment, and it didn't work, or it didn't work the way they thought it would. And so they're changing it. And you get this very living tradition in the manuscript, which is, to me, that's part of the exciting part of all this, is that history is really complex and alive, and I really love, that's part of why I love this field.
Yeah, I love hearing you discuss this because for me, a lot of the personal interest and the challenge and the satisfaction is in the research, getting really down to the ground level, the sources. I love the challenge of chasing down sources and then reading at a critical edition and then assessing sources, having a look at the scholarly debates. I love the intellectual challenge of the process, I guess, as well as the satisfaction of when you find something in the primary sources which might have been overlooked or at least maybe under-examined, at least under-examined, and you think you might be able to make a contribution or at least maybe amplify this point. I found a couple of points, for example, in the study of the question of the use of hallucinogens during the early modern witch period, and the question of whether these women who apparently thought they were flying were actually under the influence of hallucinogens. And having read so many of the literary historical critiques of that, for example, okay, we'll have to look at this text in its socio-historical context. This is a witness trial document, and the witness in question is an undereducated woman who is non-literate and has probably been tortured. And that makes it unlikely that she's going to come out with the statement reflected in the trial record unaided. It just doesn't sound like the language she would use. It expresses knowledge we couldn't expect her to use. And given the fact that she was very likely under torture, it is extremely likely that it reflects suggestions by the inquisitors. So from a literary point of view, there's that. And then from a historical point of view, you get people saying, well, okay, well, when did these hallucinogens actually even start to enter Europe? When did these plants become accessible during the period? Okay, well, mandrake and some of these weren't even available earlier on in the period from the historical point of view. And then what I really liked was I discovered a paper, quite a recent paper as well, from a pharmacological point of view, because obviously a lot of research done on, oh, these ingredients produce these effects. Yes, we know they do when administered in certain ways. But this particular paper was published in a chemistry journal, I think, and they took samples of these plants and ground them up and crushed them, and they used medieval distillation processes and then said, okay, let's see what we got. And they found that in nearly virtually every case, there were utterly negligible trace elements of the psychoactive chemicals. The distillation process just didn't pick them up or just obliterated them. So they're saying, okay, well, here's some experimental archaeology for you. It doesn't look like they could have even done this, even if with the plants, the distillation processes that they were using just didn't preserve the psychoactive elements. So even if they'd had these plants, even if they had been distilling them and turning them into potions, the processes they were using looked like they would have been actually filtered out or excluded the psychoactive elements. And I thought that was fantastic because it's a great example of this interdisciplinary approach. And then when you start putting these multiple independent approaches together, they start converging on something which becomes much more likely to be true. And it's what I love about interdisciplinary study, which I know you must be extremely familiar with, particularly in your field of study, where it's absolutely critical and where there's so much interdisciplinary work going on in these fields. I just love it when you see these multiple converging points and then somebody else brings in something new, especially some recent research, just when you think you've read everything and somebody comes along with a little paper like that and you think, wow, nobody even did that before. Literally, nobody did that. Nobody said, hey, why don't we just like cook some up using the known distillation methods of the period and see what happens? And like, well, that's what happens. So, I mean, we can't be certain, but it's not looking good. And it doesn't look like they can even make them. I thought that was brilliant. I just love that finding that kind of a gem of a paper like that. It's just intriguing. Have
Yeah,
you
there's a
ever
great
had a kind of a little light bulb moment like that yourself?
yeah, I'm sure I have. I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, the funny thing about the flying ointments is, there's the first edition of Della Porta's All Natural Magic had a flying ointment recipe. Then it was removed by the Inquisition. The Inquisition said you can't reproduce that,
Oh
and
yeah,
it was taken
right.
out. So if you look at the first couple of editions of that book, I think that book went into 20 editions or something. But there are flying ointments in there, and it's just a weird fact of history that we have recipes for flying ointments,
Mm,
and we have accounts of flight in the trials, but we
mm.
never get a crossover. We never
Yeah,
get a
right,
witch
exactly.
telling us how
Yeah,
to make the ointment, but we
right.
do get, yeah. So it's just a funny thing that We
Mm.
just associate that this is the way that it must have happened. Also, the vast majority of women who claim to have gone on flights to the Sabbath, they didn't do it on brooms; they did it on chairs.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Chairs are
Yeah. Yeah.
the most common
Yeah.
vehicle of flight. But yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific um, moment where something just sort of, you know, clicked in a way that was neat and tidy in that way. Um, yeah, nothing's immediately jumping to mind. I mean, I guess one of the things that I can say that I've really worked on, and I think I contributed something interesting is there's this famous bit about John Dee and Edward Kelly talking to angels for about 7 years,
Right.
and
Yes.
it's one of the more bizarre moments in Western history, frankly, Elizabethan history for sure. But I looked at the field of studying that material and what was interesting when I got into that topic, which I'd been interested in since I was basically a teenager, is that no one had actually tried to give a theory about what happened.
Oh, right.
What in
Really?
the
Yeah.
world were they were talking to? What
Yeah.
was happening? And
Mm.
when I was in Amsterdam, I wrote a paper about this, and no one had actually. The general consensus basically at that time was that Edward Kelly, the medium, the scryer, was just a
Yeah.
fraud.
Yeah. He was the
And
grifter, and D was the naive
yeah, the
uh
naive,
guy who was just taken in. Yeah.
right.
The
And you
patsy.
look at
Yeah.
the data, and that's just not true. It's just
Mm.
that it's just that's definitely not the entire story. And uh, and it was fun to sit down and actually study Edward Kelly and really get into his head and really learn a lot about him. And I wrote what I think is still now the definitive paper on sort of trying to get at what might have
Oh,
happened.
brilliant.
And it was a really fun paper to write, and coming to the conclusion that that there's a whole episode I want to make on what I call pious fraud
Right. Yep.
that you can and I think this applies to people like Joseph Smith and other people where um, you can what Tanya Luhrmann calls epistemic drift, where one can
Mm.
drift in and out of believing things that are somewhere in between you concocting them and them happening. And I think that this is a sort of an interesting epistemological gulf where we either want to put people in tidy boxes and say, "Oh, Joseph Smith was
Mm.
just a con artist,"
Right.
and that's just not borne out by all the things that he did in the interest of forwarding his movement. If he just wanted to con people, there are a lot easier cons out there. He put
Absolutely.
himself
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
great risk and
Mm.
ultimately was killed. And so I think that we need to have more sophisticated categories to talk about this, especially when it comes to religious matters. But at any rate, that was a fun place where, I basically was able to take a otherwise extraordinarily strange and mysterious moment in history and then present a theory about how it may have happened in a way that doesn't involve spirits or, there might be spirits, I don't know. But and saying, look, this is a better explanatory model than, oh, that guy was just a grifter. And to have scholars look at it and go, this is way better. This is a far better model of understanding it. And it, sort of set the field on a new foot. And that feels it's kind of
Very
what you want to do as
satisfying.
it's very satisfying. And again, you take, I think scholars take we take great pleasure
Mm.
in doing that scholarly work to help move the conversation forward as a discipline.
I think it's a great example. And I think it's also an example of how scholarship is literally very, very generally open to good faith criticism when the work's done properly, following proper scholastic method and academic principles, and when people actually make themselves available for peer review and criticism. As you would know, the people who skulk on YouTube channels and Twitter accounts making grandiose claims about scholarship who never quite managed to submit anything for peer review or scrutiny by the academics that they say are so scared of their theories, yeah, definitely should be looked at with a side eye because if they're so determined that their views are correct and that mainstream scholarship is terrified of them, well, why not submit them to peer review? But of course, they don't want them placed under that kind of scrutiny because scholars are not their real audience. Their real audience is the public. They want an audience who's going to subject them to considerably less scrutiny. And sometimes I think it's a question of just a little bit of personal doubt for those people who are at least genuine in their beliefs. And for the grifters, it's just simply a way of staying out of trouble and making sure that people who really know what they're talking about don't look too closely at what they're saying. I think that's particularly the case with the pseudo-archaeologists, definitely with the people who leverage esotericism and hermeticism for very obvious personal gain to gain a following, and who inevitably tie it into pseudo-history. I think you might have seen yourself how that nobody's getting rich by making YouTube videos about fake alchemy, right? Or fake hermeticism or fake Gnosticism, right? It's got to be linked to something else, right? You got to link it to something else. It's linked to some kind of culture war thing, or it's linked to some other ideology. And that's where the danger is, because then it gets used as a lever. But that kind of stuff doesn't make money by itself. It's going to be linked to some kind of new age thing, which again is going to be linked to some cultural phenomenon, right? Because new age beliefs are a cultural phenomenon. They're their response to a crisis of modernity, or particularly in the 90s, post-modernity, right? So it's the fact that they get linked to these other issues, like we are talking about before, how Gnosticism is linked by cultural warriors such as James Lindsay to other things he doesn't like socialism and LGBTQ rights. And then it's leveraged in very specific ideological ways with very real world effects and harm. You don't grift on alchemy by doing alchemy videos, right? You've got to connect it with something else. At least if you're selling alchemy kits or something like that. But then who's selling alchemy kits who doesn't really believe it? I don't think it's the grifters who are selling the alchemy kits. They're selling an ideology. They're selling something else. If you know what I mean? It's the same with the Gnosticism.
I think they're typically selling themselves. I mean, it's guruism,
Right. Yeah,
and that's
guruism. That's a
typically,
very good way to
yeah,
put it. Yeah.
it's guruism. They're just using fancy sounding, spooky, mysterious stuff as a way of propping up their own their self as a brand. And yeah, I'm not a guru. I don't have the truth. I
Yeah.
don't deal like I
Right.
like if you I'm happy to put my philosopher hat on and we can do the metaphysics and we can do that. But at the end of the day, anyone who's peddling in the truth of alchemy or something like that, that's a clear indicator to me that they don't know the field actually, because the truth of the matter is
Right.
that the field's very there's a lot we don't know. And yeah, when people sometimes ask me like, why don't you go and debunk, James Lindsay or
Mm.
I don't know, people of Robert Sepper and stuff like this. And I'm like, I don't do that debunking work because, and not to say that it shouldn't be done. I think there are people out there who do a great job doing debunking work, but I don't do it because I think that it allows the pseudo history and the pseudo archaeology to have the initiative. And if
Right.
I'm
I
gonna,
see.
if
Yep.
and the best way to do in my opinion, the best way to do that so-called debunking is just to put authentic information out there.
Mm.
And the
Kind of
fact that,
inoculate people, right?
yeah. And so like when someone says that they have the secret truths of Atlantean alchemy from Thoth or whatever,
Yes.
it's just like when you string a bunch of esoteric words together, people who have watched a video about, I don't know, the god Thoth that I've done or the Emerald Tablet, and when
Yes.
I'm
Right.
actually talking about here it is in the Arabic original,
Mm.
here's the transmission history, here's all the things we know about
Yeah.
it. I think that means that when someone's watched that video, assuming they have, and then some other guy gets on there and saying, "Oh, it came from Atlantis and it's full of magical power," they're gonna like, "Huh? Like that doesn't
Right. Yeah,
make."
exactly. They're like, wait a minute. Yeah, I know from that other video that this didn't even emerge until like late antiquity. Yeah.
Yeah, like this is
You
a
you
ninth
you
century.
have a
Yeah,
video, on Hermes Trismegistus, don't you? I'm pretty sure you
I'm
had one
sure I
on.
do. Yeah,
Yeah, because I know I saw one of yours, which was definitely on the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet, and I was sure you did the history of Hermes Trismegistus in there as well. I'll have to have a look there, but I was sure you did it because it was one thing I was looking for when I first started really taking an interest in your channel. I thought, okay, he's got to have this covered. He's got to have this covered because I like having sources like yours, for actually precisely for this reason. I like being able to have videos which on topics which is way above my pay grade and which would take me far too long to research as kind of methods of inoculating people, not just debunk, but even better, pre-bunking. I don't know
right.
if that's a word,
Yeah,
but yeah, but inoculation is the idea, right? You're giving people facts in an accessible way, which actually makes them properly informed and in an intellectually satisfying way as well, because it's very complete, then it actually gives them the discernment. They go, oh, this other guy is talking about this text being much older, and then but I don't know, but I mean, he doesn't seem to be doing the same thing. Where are his sources? He's not integrating
Right.
the sources. He's not systematizing the research. He's never cited the academic scholarship. Where's this stuff coming from?
And that's
Yeah,
also the thing I do. At the end of every Esoterica episode, I basically lay out here are the top three resources for learning more about
yeah,
this
yeah,
because
that's right. Yeah.
YouTube videos are not the end of a conversation. They're not You're not an expert on anything because you watched a YouTube
Mm,
video. And I always tell people, look, if you're really interested in this, this is where you need to go. Here are here are the resources, and I cite my sources, and I give people access to those texts, and often with a good bit of complaining about how expensive they are. But
yes, yes.
and it's a real bad part of academic publishing, which I have a lot to say about. But it
Mm,
really is, if someone's telling you a bunch of wild stuff about how ancient Atlantis, this, that, and the other, and they've not given you good sources to vet that, and well, you know which direction to run. And so,
mm.
yeah, but yeah, and again, I find that so much of that stuff is just like I said, it's guru stuff. It's they want to be believed because they have they have they want to be believed because it's part of their brand, whether this is Graham
Right.
Hancock or whatever. And I honestly don't think that Graham Hancock is working in total bad faith in the way that some of these people are.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree. Yeah, I think
no,
there's I think he actually believes his own shtick. I don't think that he's a grifter in that sense.
yeah, yeah, I agree. I think the grifters are Netflix who are platforming that stuff while not
Yeah, very
platforming
definitely. Yeah, yeah.
um, not platforming actual rigorous archaeological work because it's just frankly not sexy in the same way that
Mm,
there's a vast conspiracy of archaeologists who are blah 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 blah. That just makes for good TV.
right.
And again,
Mm,
I think the grifters are the shareholders at Netflix or whatever. But yeah, I like I said, I don't go in the route of debunking. I'd rather just make reliable content and then ask people like when you're watching a video about something and someone's not telling you if someone can't show you the text in the original language,
mm,
um, why aren't they doing that? Because we live in an age where that's relatively accessible.
mm.
And if they're not doing it, they're not doing it either out of laziness or they're not doing it because they're tricking you. There's
Yeah,
some
right.
scam here. So it's and neither is acceptable. Intellectual laziness nor conning an audience. Neither one of those is morally acceptable. Yeah. So yeah, I've recreated alchemical experiments in the interest of sort of like forensic history, I suppose you could call it.
Yeah, yeah, like
Um,
experimental archaeology for the for
exactly.
the for the history
Yeah.
people. Yeah,
Yeah, so it's something like that. But I have to, I have to be very guarded and very careful when I say that because one, I don't do that publicly because
sure.
I don't have any chemistry background. So, and also it's not
Yeah,
the kind of
yeah.
thing I would do on camera really to make a content of it with some rare exceptions because it's dangerous.
Mm.
Yeah,
Oh,
no, I don't think
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
exactly. I mean,
I
so
don't
there's
think
some of those
anyone
chemicals. Yeah. I think it's
alchemy and I mean,
Boyle who's talking about the heating effects of holding mercury in your hand, in the palm of your hand, this kind of thing. Really wild stuff. And they're like,
no,
yes, but
it's
is that from the inner fire of the mercury? Is it some reaction of the mercury with the hand? Yeah, probably some reaction of the mercury with the hand, dude. Yeah.
very possibly, yeah, yeah, not that's not safe stuff. So and just
Mm,
mercurial fumes and things like that. Yeah, so it's not the kind of thing that I
mm,
would publicly. Yeah, so
mm.
yeah, you have to be pretty careful of that kind of stuff. But there are some things. I have some. When alchemy transitioned to under the aegis of Paracelsianism, it sort of
Right.
began to transition into iatrochemistry and
Mm.
basically the early pharmaceuticals. Some of that stuff I've been able to recreate.
Right. Yeah.
And
Fascinating. Yeah.
so those are that's a bit safer than working with
Yeah. Yeah. You're probably
cinnabar
aware of
or
the speculation that Newton's famous manic episode, where he became very emotionally unpredictable and had these manic episodes. Some scholars believe that may have been a result of poisoning through mercury or some alkalis he was using in his alchemical process. It's a bit of a stretch because he had this just temporary period of very uncharacteristic behavior for a while, and many of his friends were very, very confused that he was acting very, very wild and unstable. But yeah, it's at this distance, it's a little more than speculation, but it's an interesting one.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. I can't comment on that, but yeah, it's.
Mm.
I think the life expectancy of alchemists was a bit shorter
Yeah,
than other
definitely.
people. But also, alchemists tended to be poor. This is a thing that we often don't talk about is that,
Right,
the
right.
alchemists who write books are upper class people, but alchemy was very much associated with poorer people in a lot
Mm,
of ways, and,
mm.
their working conditions are quite bad.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because Newton was very much a physicalist and a realist. And so he wasn't actually approaching, because one of the first chemists, obviously. So he was not interested in the mystical elements of alchemy, but he was far more interested in its actual real world chemical properties. And of course, as
Yeah.
Master of the Mint, he was particularly concerned about the idea that anybody could turn
Yeah,
base
for
metal into
forgery. Yeah.
gold. Yeah, and he
Yeah.
was
Yeah. And
telling
this,
Boyle, don't talk about this stuff. Don't encourage people to do this because if anyone cracks it, we're all in trouble.
this is a constant worry. And this is, in Central Europe, you could be a victim of your own success. If you claim
Mm.
successfully to have transmuted metals, you're basically put under arrest immediately
Yeah,
because
right,
these people
exactly.
aren't
Highly
stupid. They know.
subversive.
Yeah, they're gonna get you, and we're gonna work for the state because they
Yeah,
don't want you producing gold because
crash the
it'll upset the
economy.
economy, and so
Yeah.
they knew that, and so yeah, I mean, you could be people often were surprised to claim successful transmutation and find themselves arrested
Mm.
immediately thereafter and held in basically these tower laboratories. And now the question is, you're going to work for the Holy Roman Empire, or are they going to throw you out this window?
Right.
And
Yeah, I think
that
that's very interesting because people automatically think, oh, they were arrested because they were doing magic, and then the king's very scared of magic. No, no, no. The king's got far more practical concerns. And if you're the
no, yeah.
guy who makes the gold out of lead, then yeah, he's locking you up in a room.
Yeah, they need you. You're the you're the NASA scientists that they need to get
Yeah.
to get working for you. And it's also funny that of course the Holy Roman Empire also had a gold-plated gibbet they hung alchemists
Oh,
from that couldn't
oh,
do
wow,
what they
really?
said.
Oh,
And so if you're convicted of
oh,
alchemical fraud, you swung from a big yellow gibbet, which I've always appreciated the flair for.
very appropriate irony.
Yeah, the flair for
The
cruelty.
dramatic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah. Well, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you. I really appreciate the time you've taken, especially you've been very generous with your time. And it's been fantastic just learning from you as well. And it's been great, I think, for my audience to be exposed to a channel like this of your quality and to understand from a scholar just how important that scholarly process is. So thank you very much once again.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.